comes to political messaging, two major targets to agitate the public and drive them to the polls are fear and emotion. Methods of this type were laid out in books like Propaganda by Edward Bernays and used as tools in political programs like Agitation Propaganda. To learn more about this, we've invited to speak with us Connor Boyack, author of Feardom, How Politicians Exploit Your Emotions and What You Can Do to Stop Them. Let's jump into that now. Hey, Connor Boyack, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going into an election again, and as always, of course, fear is always one of the big themes that is used. It's used on both sides of the aisle. In terms of, I can understand for politicians, it's a way to get people, say, internally agitated enough where they're driven to go to the polls and go vote. Otherwise, they may not have the motivation to do so. But you've, of course, warned about this phenomenon. You've written about it, and you see it as kind of a not healthy way of doing politics. Could you tell us about some of what your thoughts are on this?
Absolutely. So, fear is a raw emotion. It's actually also a data signal in our brain. And the way fear is processed in our brain responds to that data connection more quickly than the rational portion of our brain in processing information. What that really means is that our brains are more likely to respond to fear than they are to objective reasoning about a threat. So think of, my wife being scared by this tiny little spider. Well, she has this fear, so she has this overwhelming reaction when the rational part of her brain knows that spider is not likely to jump on her and bite her or anything like that. We as humans are more quickly to respond to that. What's dangerous about that is that this is information that anyone can learn about and act upon. Fear can be weaponized by people who want to change our behavior in a way where our rational minds might not agree, but they can use fear, particularly messaging, to get us to change our behavior. Maybe it's to open up our wallets because we don't want, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden to win. And so the Trump campaign is, using the fear of socialism or a democratic takeover to get us to change our behavior and contribute money to them. Maybe it's traveling. The government, now has TSA and, we don't want another 9/11 or an underwear bomber or shoe bomber. So now you need to partially disrobe every time you want the privilege of flight because we are so fearful of that thing from happening. We've seen it right now, certainly in the current climate we're in, where people's behaviors change because of fear. Now, there are many things to be fearful of. There are legitimate threats, absolutely. However, the history of our society, our US government, as I document in my book, clearly shows that fear has been weaponized time and again by politicians and the media who want to take advantage of us and manipulate us into a set of behaviors that otherwise we might not do. So it's something we all need to be very cautious about.
One of the original books on marketing, which was Propaganda, I think it was written, prior to the 1930s. I can't remember the author's name on it now. But
Edward
it really
Bernays.
framed Edward Bernays. Thank you. Yeah. And it's a very interesting book. It's not a big book. It's worth reading if you're interested, for our viewers. But it says something interesting, which is the people who control the ideas of a society are the, say, true powers over a society. And people who hold that power may not even realize they hold it. And the whole book is about how to manipulate that. Bernays is talking about using it for marketing, but that book was picked up by not just advertisers, but also by governments looking to use the same exact methods to, say, agitate people emotionally and drive them into action. And when I was researching a lot about socialism, National Socialism, fascism, and trying to figure out how these systems related, because I've written about it before, I found something very interesting, which is that Lenin used these tactics as part of the whole Pavlov dog experiment on how do you create emotional memory and make people react from that emotional memory where they've been conditioned to act a certain way, even though they may not realize they're doing it. And actually Mussolini with fascism talked about the same thing. He talked about making people think from their reptilian brain, this primitive part of our brain that acts on things like, just like you're talking about, this fear, this primal instinct. I'm curious, what did you find in terms of I guess, how this is used and what are the origins of these things?
You're absolutely right in pointing out the historical examples that are very clear on this point. In fact, Edward Bernays, when he wrote Propaganda, he also wrote another book called Crystallizing Public Opinion. Both are, in my opinion, essential for anyone interested not only in marketing and psychology, but more particularly in political science. Here is a guy who is laying bare the early foundations of propaganda when this new public relations industry was just getting off the ground and then being applied by people in government to manipulate human behavior. He was shocked, in fact, that the Nazis had found his book Crystallizing Public Opinion and were using it as the basis for their own propaganda efforts. Well, of course, propaganda or marketing or even messaging, like with fear, it's a tool. Like a gun, you can use it to murder someone in cold blood. You can also use it to defend yourself against someone else. A tool can be used either way. So too with our communication. You can use it to inform and edify and uplift and engage. You can also use it to manipulate people. And so Edward Bernays here, as by the way, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and so he's learning a lot from his uncle about how the mind works, is then sharing with people, here's this tool. And he, in fact, used it in a very negative way in the Woodrow Wilson, certainly then was being used by the Nazis. It's important for us to understand this for one very important reason. Even if your viewers are not in the business of changing public opinion, they're not in media or politics or anything else like that, we are all being inundated with messages by people who understand this playbook, who understand how to leverage this tool. And if we do not want to be like, the boy who cried wolf, right? The villagers kept believing him over and over again, right? We want to understand truth. We want to know who the truth tellers are. And so we need to understand how the manipulators are out there acting if we ourselves want to be free of their control. Otherwise, we're just going to be duped and led along more easily. And I will say this as a little anecdote to put an exclamation point on this. Here I am, the author of this book, Feardom. I've studied this in detail when I did the book. I did a deep dive into it. It's been about 5 years since we published the book. And I find myself, having done a deep dive on this information, becoming susceptible to the very things that I wrote about in the book because I'm human. Even the most knowledgeable of us that, other people and academics are, let alone me who looked into this, we understand these things, and yet we ourselves are still falling prey to the very same tactics. So it's just so critical that we have our eyes open to how people in power are trying to scare us into submission so that we surrender our freedoms, so that we empower them with new tools and programs and budgets. This is their end goal, is control. And they are able to achieve that by keeping us in fear of what could happen if we don't go along with their plans. It is something that's happened throughout human history, throughout American history. It's certainly happening today.
Yeah, well, as part of my own research into the history of journalism, because as a journalist, I've tried not following the current of what journalism has become, because personally I don't like what it's become. And the question is, how do you be a responsible journalist? How do you tell the truth? And how do you present the proper context and narrative without falling into opinion, emotion, and so on that might alter the truth of the presentation? And I think it's a very difficult process to do, but through my research, I found that there's been a lot of changes in the history of journalism that has brought in different practices that do practice these things. And I think by recognizing them, it helps me to not do it myself. But personally, when I read a lot of other media these days, it's like I feel sick in my stomach. And this is one of the big tactics I've seen they do, and it's something you see in new journalism. So a lot of big publications, the standard of journalism these days is new journalism. It's this storytelling, this weaving together of a narrative story using unnamed sources, random sources, and so on to paint this story-like picture, which may or may not be accurate. But they oftentimes also latch it onto a political goal. And so, for example, this can be used for, say, unofficial political lobbying under the guise of journalism. And I'll give you just one example. and how I see it being used. Now, let's say, for example, I want you to support or oppose, let's say, illegal immigration. If I want you to support it, I might highlight one person who has been victimized by it, write a whole long narrative piece about this person's, story, and then I will bring you through an emotional journey by doing that. If I want to make you support it, I might find, a kid who was brought up here by his parents and tell the sad story of how he grew up and how he escaped it. Now, I think journalism like this has its uses, but there are also people, in terms of presenting an accurate picture, because you do want to see how these things affect people. But at the same time, it has its manipulative uses, which I think journalists should avoid, which is this. You cause people to develop emotional memory. They feel they've been on that emotional journey because even if they can rationally understand, I just read a story, they've gone through an emotional journey where they've empathized with these people. And because of that, they associate that emotion with that political issue. And there are journalists who do this intentionally. And we see, for example, in 2016, 2015, with this Trump-Russia investigations, and really scandal after scandal that has been proven false most of the time. Scandal after scandal gets proven false, it disappears and people forget about it. But what remains, even if the story is proven false, is the emotional memory. And just like Pavlov's dog, just like with Lenin, people are conditioned over time to react unconsciously to these stimuli. The stimuli being the issue, the name, the label, and the, say, emotional reaction to that stimuli being the emotional memory. And so when that comes up again, they have that feeling, and that feeling is what motivates them to act. I mean, it's an interesting science behind it, but it's a terribly manipulative way of doing things that I have a lot of problems with. And I find it interesting to see that you've exposed a lot of this in your own work. I'm curious, in your own research, how have you seen media especially using this tactic?
Oh, there's so many cases to share it. It's amazing. Imagine right now, as we're recording this, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, the media has completely shifted the goalposts along with all of the experts in what we're supposed to be scared of, right? First, it was how many deaths, and then it was hospital overutilization, right? And then we find that many hospitals have laid workers off, and all the new hospitals they built just for all these patients haven't been used. So now we're led to be scared of all the case numbers. And imagine in years past, had the media been presenting every single day live counters on the bottom of the screens, how many people died from other things, say the seasonal flu or heart disease or diabetes or whatever, we would be in a panic because we would be updated every day and our attention would be shifted myopically to that very specific thing. As you point out with illegal immigration, you can divert people's attention to a sympathetic case, and there may be an injustice happening there that is worth highlighting and worth sharing that story. The importance of using our rational brain to override it or at least complement our emotional side of our brain is to look at the bigger picture context, right? As the goalposts in COVID-19 are shifting, or as illegal immigration is causing harm to very specific people, we still need to take a step back and look at the big picture, because like any magician knows, sleight of hand is what's important. You're looking here, not seeing what my other hand is doing, and that's how I'm able to deceive you into going along with something else. The media may be diverting our attention over here, either wittingly or unwittingly, whereas the people in power and control are trying to have something else happen over here. I remember several years ago when the swine flu was the case, the media dedicated 43% of its airtime to the swine flu. People were in a panic. Thousands of pigs were being slaughtered. Hand sanitizer flew off the shelves. People were induced into this state of fear because of the media alarm, where half of all of their airtime was focused on this issue. In that particular case, it was like 25 people who died from it. It comparatively was not that big of a deal. And yet the people were led along from one thing to another to be in this constant state of panic. It was H.L. Mencken who said that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, he said, most of them imaginary. That's the whole aim of popular politics. The media has been a very supportive audience, of course, because if we are in this constant dopamine drip, if we're addicted emotionally via this constant state of dopamine and fear to every new headline that's coming out, as you point out, we're not paying attention to the corrections that are coming out days later by responsible media to say, oh, well, we misreported that, or, oh, we're always just being led along from one thing to the next. And that is how the Rahm Emanuels of the world will step up and say, never let a good crisis go to waste. We can use and manipulate, mold like clay, people who are so fearful of everything that is happening to advance whatever agenda we want. I document in Feardom a number of examples where the government was able to do this, and it is something that should be of heightened alarm for us, because Exhibit A is playing out right before our eyes, where the government is gaining all kinds of power and control over the economy. All kinds of precedent is being set that could be used in the future for authoritarian control by governors or health directors. There's all kinds of stuff happening that, in our rational mind, we might want to pause and say, we need to analyze this and in context if this is the right thing. Whereas everyone is just, like Mencken said, clamorous to be led to safety, willing to defeat whatever hobgoblin we're presented with. And in so doing, we surrender a lot of our freedoms and expand the power and size of the government.
Great. So I guess just last question, through your research, through understanding these things, what do you recommend to people in terms of how to deal with this environment? Because we're at a state now, I mean, it was bad in the past. A lot of these things they've been working since like the 1930s, even earlier than that. Actually, we go back in history much earlier than that. And even then it was difficult for people to cope with. Now we can't even go to the bathroom without looking at our phones, most of us. We're staring at computer screens all day, and everything we look at is bombarding us with different headlines, different news stories, and different, say, claims from every part of the world. Given this state, what do you recommend for people through your own findings in terms of how to deal with this?
That's the best question to ask and the hardest one to answer. When I was writing the conclusion to this book, I wanted to not only talk about the problem, I wanted to say, what are some solutions? And at the end of the day, it boils down to, I think, just a few things. The first is you have to find trusted sources in media. You cannot continue to listen to the people who have misled and lied to you in the past, like the boy who cried wolf. If they have been a guilty offender or intentionally manipulative of your emotions in pursuit of some agenda, avoid them. Find other sources of media. Another thing I found useful is kind of out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all truth be established, right? Find concurrence, find people who are saying similar things. And that's how you can start to gravitate towards kind of not the consensus is how all truth shall be established. Global warming, there's apparently a consensus among a bunch of scientists. That doesn't necessarily mean what they believe is true, but it's at least a filter through which we can start to drown out some of the more extreme voices that are making outlandish claims. Another thing I found useful is especially when looking at American type of politics and events and occurrences, sometimes the foreign media will do a better job at reporting on what is happening because the local media is so, bought out, sold out, whatever the case may be. Having an additional outside perspective on internal issues is also helpful. The real big solution and the hardest one, even for me who wrote this book that I share, is that we have to counteract fear. And that's a moral issue, an ethical issue, a religious, spiritual issue. For me, it ultimately comes down to love. We need to have compassion. We need to have sympathy and empathy for those around us. We can't fear our neighbors and that they might kill us if we come within a certain amount of feet of them. If we begin to fear one another, we lose our humanity, and we are more willing to, as the Stanford experiment, for example, shows, there have been all kinds of psychological experiments showing that when it's the other, when it's dehumanized, this is how wars are conducted. First, it's psychological warfare to dehumanize the other side so that humans are willing to go kill other people. We need to replace fear with love. That is far easier said than done. Deeper topic for another day, but we need to look inside of ourselves and figure out how we can shed the fear and not be so easily manipulated. And whether for you that's kind of a moral ethical thing or a spiritual thing, we need to reclaim our humanity and not be so willing to be manipulated by those who want us to dehumanize others and thus be willing to control and have power over them. For me, it boils down to love. How we get there is everyone's own question and pursuit, but I know of no other way to counteract the fear that we see throughout history and that we see today than to counteract it with its opposite. And that's something I'm, trying to improve each day myself.
Connor Boyack, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.